The gospel reading this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, the 13th chapter, verses 31 through 35. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Go to tell that fox for me, listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I desire your children together as a hen gathers, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes. Saying, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is the gospel, Lord, to you, O Christ. The sermon text this morning is what's Diane text, the first text from Genesis 15. Well, one of the stories I find most fascinating in the Old Testament is indeed the story of Abraham. Same person who's changed by God at 17 as God proclaimed him to become the father of many nations. Whether the story of Abraham is historically factual or not, I think is secondary. I think the depiction of Abram represents well what it means to be human, both then and now, with hopes and dreams for what life is supposed to be like, including questions around having children. He's also who listens closely to God and his faith in the and has faith in the plan that God has for him. It is in this story where we see God making a covenant, not only with Abram, but with all of humankind for ages to come. It is in this story of Abram where we see that God is a God who more than anything desires close relation with God's people. I believe that the very reason people are relational is that we are created in the image of a highly relational God. God seeks to be in relationship with us, just as most people seek to be in relationship with one another. There are, however, some differences between the way we relate to one another and the way God relates. We all know that human relationships can be complicated and difficult at times. Whether we're talking about romantic relationships or close friendships or even relationships among siblings or parents and children. We so often feel vulnerable and afraid to get hurt by those we love, so we often remain quite guarded in our close relationships. Even so, we continue, I think, to long for perfect relationships, which of course do not really exist. Imperfect people, who we all are simply not capable of creating perfect relationships. Yet I think most of us agree that we are indeed wired to be in relationship. Deep down, we have a longing for close and trusting relationships. Well, in Genesis 15, that we just heard, we hear that God establishes a very unique relationship with Abram. He is entering into what is referred to as a covenant relationship with him. Well, in human terms, we usually define covenant as an agreement between two or more persons. That sounds like a pretty equal way of entering into a relationship. But we see here that biblical covenants, where God is one of the parties, are totally lopsided. We see that God is the initiator of the covenant. We see that God initiates the relationship. We see that God is the one making the promises. We see that God is the one acting out this covenant. In the ancient Middle East, long before signing mutual contracts came about, covenants were sometimes sealed by the custom of cutting animals in half and placing the two halves of each animal apart from each other, making a path between them. The two parties making the covenant would then begin walking from opposite ends of this path, between the animals, passing each other in the middle and ending up where the other person began. They walked between the pieces, declaring that they would be cut in half like these animals if they failed to keep up their end of the covenant. Thus, the practice was called cutting a covenant. Sounds like serious business, doesn't it? Well, God directed Abram to bring the animals, to cut them in half, making the path between them. Symbolic form of fire, which we often hear in other places too. God and God alone is the one who passes between these pieces. Abram is simply the passive observer. From then on, Abram is asked to continue in that relationship with God and to do his part in establishing and maintaining relationships with people and also with the earth. Abraham traveled, and he settles. He has close family and he encounters strangers. Sometimes he is good on this relationship thing, sometimes not so much. Quite typically human, won't you say? And so through the ages, this story comes to us. It's a story of God who reaches out to God's people of every age and place. It's a story of people who respond or at least attempt to respond fully. Well, thousands of years later, God is still keeping God's end of the covenant. And we are still trying our best to be faithful in keeping our end of the covenant, to be God's people in the world, to build and maintain godly relationships. God reached out to us through Abraham a long time ago, and God still continues to do so. Call relationships is always before us. And if there is one relationship we are called to set above all, it is our relationship with God. We are, however, human, and being human means that we aren't perfect. Sometimes we are, as Abraham, good at relationships, sometimes not so much. But we need to remember that the original promise of relationship is made by God. God is it with the world in God's covenant with Abraham, and it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Now it's up to us what we want to do with such a gift. We can work on building a closer relationship with God, and we can work on building closer relationships with one another. Or, as we sometimes do, we can choose to ignore this gift God has given us. But we should always remember that God has created us for relationships. The story of Abraham reminds us about a few things. It reminds us that we can trust God above all things, even when we, in our humanness, sometimes find ourselves a bit lost, or when we doubt, or when we believe that we are the ones who know best. This story also tells us that perhaps we need to be better at listening to God's voice. It is hard to build a good relationship with God if we are the ones telling God what we want all the time, but we do not make the effort to listen for what God wants from us and for us. Abraham seems to be pretty good at hearing God's voice. Or maybe God spoke more clearly back then. I really don't know. I don't know about you, but sometimes in my life, I find myself seeking God, not as the first, but perhaps the second, or sometimes even the last option. There are times when I follow my own mind first, and I sometimes find myself turning to God for advice only when my decisions don't seem to work out so well. So as we continue our Lenten journey, perhaps we can learn something from Abraham's walk, so that we also may grow in faith and learn to trust God more fully. May it be a time of strengthening our relationship with God. And perhaps there are relationships with those around us and those we are closest to that we also need to mend. Perhaps Lent can be a time for us to learn to listen for God's voice, follow God's voice guidance, follow God's guidance more closely, so that we can more fully into the kind of lives and the kind of relationships that God has in store for us. Amen.